Whenever you open up social media, it won't take long for you to come across some 16-year-old undoubtedly taking high doses of PEDs. Sadly, this is not uncommon to see anymore. It feels as though they're getting younger and younger, not aware of how dangerous these drugs can be. But that wasn't always the case. It begs the question, how did we get to this point, and how did steroids become so glorified amongst this young generation? Now, for us to understand the story that's about to unfold, we first need to understand where steroids even came from and how they were viewed at first. When we look at the history of steroids, it all really began in the year 1849. This was the year where scientists first discovered testosterone, how it was made in the testicles, and some of the hormonal workings in the body. So it is quite clear that there wasn't any steroid use before this, since it wasn't even understood. But after 1849 is when things really began to change. Between 1849 and the 1930s, testosterone couldn't be produced synthetically, meaning they could not produce it in a lab yet. So any athlete experimenting with hormones between 1849 and the 1930s would directly inject testosterone from the testicles of animals into themselves, one of those being Charles Edouard Brown-Séquard. He was one of the first athletes to experiment with this and claimed that the injection he made from guinea pigs and dogs led to rejuvenation and prolonged life. It was known in the scientific community as the Brown-Séquard elixir. In the next decade after that, scientists really only tried to understand how this hormone actually worked and why it had these effects on the human body. Positive effects were known, but it wasn't understood why they happened, until we arrived at an iconic date. In 1939, Adolf Butenandt and Leopold Ruzicka won the Nobel Prize for being the first to synthesize testosterone and isolate it. Remember, before that, any athlete using any form of testosterone did it by directly injecting from animal testicles, and thus was still very rare at the time. From that point, however, developing steroids really began to turn into a business, as well as pharmacies who started to mass produce them. That was the point when they became cheaper and more accessible to the public, but obviously more used by strength athletes and bodybuilders. During the late 1930s and the Second World War, you had Charles Kuchakin, who essentially became a synthetic steroid pioneer by making many human studies to specifically study the muscle-building effects of testosterone. For example, during the Second World War, with grants from the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation and various compounds donated by drug manufacturers, he focused his research on their possible use in healing the wounds and bones of injured soldiers. The rise of steroids wasn't too much of a surprise at the time. Prices really became cheaper, more companies started to produce them, as well as consumers who consumed them, and there was much more awareness about the positive effects of it. For example, in 1949, a book called The Male Hormone by Paul de Kruif was published. This book essentially described the benefits and effects of testosterone and would ultimately begin widespread use of steroids in bodybuilding. Now, they could have already been used for bodybuilding purposes before that. Let us take Burt Goodrich, who won the first Mr. America in 1938 and was likely already using them. But outside of that, during the silver era of bodybuilding, we had John Grimmick, who won the first Mr. Universe in 1948, who admitted to using them back then, or Steve Reeves, who most likely also used them. Steroid use became very common in the bodybuilding community and would only set the tone for the upcoming decades. During the golden era of bodybuilding is when influencer marketing really took off, with Joe Weider combining the most influential bodybuilders at the time, such as Arnold, Lou Ferrigno, Franco Columbu, and many more, and used them to market his products. Some of them included muscle bracelets to strengthen your arms, a 5-minute body shaper that allows you to shed off 10 pounds in just 2 weeks, and with just one twist and 1 second, people in the ads added inches of muscle. Except this marketing was very misleading. Nowadays it seems obvious to us, but back in the days fitness wasn't common knowledge, and people weren't aware that what truly turned Arnold into the man he was simply a combination of genetics, work ethic, and PEDs, not a shitty 5-minute body shaper and 2 weeks of training. See, although steroids were very common in the bodybuilding community, they were still very unknown to the general public. It wasn't common knowledge for people that bodybuilders used PEDs, and this trend of people not being aware of it would keep going for decades after, until we arrived in the late 2000s. The biggest changes in the beginning of the 21st century are the technological advances we've had, including the rise of social media. As more and more people started to move their attention towards these platforms, so did the fitness industry. As these platforms grew, people and companies began to understand the financial opportunity there was. When you develop an audience that trusts you, it is a lot easier to repeatedly sell to that audience. It is essentially completely free targeted advertising to people who trust you. But as any excellent opportunity, you naturally have a lot of competition and you have to find ways to stand out from the rest. There's many ways to do this, but generally it is by bringing something completely new or being extreme and polarizing. Essentially anything that elicits a strong emotional reaction in people. Within the fitness industry, people tend to drift their attention towards people who either have extreme physiques, take extreme action, or have extreme beliefs, and that is where the problem lies. Many influencers simply started taking steroids as a means to develop a much better physique and therefore stand out from the rest. Now here's the thing. People at that point might have been aware after a few decades that steroids were heavily used in competitive bodybuilding and that bodybuilders were using PEDs. But this image they had built in their minds was that steroids equated to being huge and muscular. They were associated with that big look, not smaller and leaner looking guys. Because of this lack of knowledge on the public side, many in the fitness industry used it to their own advantage. Just like Arnold in the 70s, influencers sold their products or products of other companies with them as the main selling point, but without ever mentioning their enhanced status. We began to be faced with what we call these days fake naturals. Someone who claims to be natural but is actually using steroids or performance enhancing drugs. This line obviously came at the detriment of their audience. When you use yourself as the main selling point to sell training programs or promote other brands to your audience, it is deceiving because you are setting wrong expectations for what people can expect. If someone pretends a certain training program got them results, when in reality it is the drugs they took that did, it is very misleading, just like in the 70s with Joe Weider's marketing. As social media grew more and more, the competition grew as well, and therefore the percentage of fake natty grew at the same time. Many other influencers didn't find this acceptable, and so came the rise of a more open fitness industry. Now, where this all began isn't really clear, but there are some dates that can be set. For example, on the 1st of March 2017 is when the first official Natty or Not was posted by Kenny KO, which had the goal to call out people in the fitness industry who lied about taking PEDs. Soon after, many others would start to do the same thing. More plays, more dates, Greg Doucette, and so on. Besides that, we could also see the rise of many open influencers wanting to counter some of the damage done. That is a very positive wave. Opening up about steroid use and calling out others who were taking them and lied about it. That's because anyone watching would be able to adjust their own expectations for their own goals. If they're natural and they know that their favorite influencer that they look up to isn't, they'll be able to lower their own standards and have much more realistic expectations. It allowed people to not get scammed by some influencers who promise amazing results like they have. Now, while that sounds good at first, it kinda backfired. Even though being honest and transparent and calling out people for lying is fantastic, it unfortunately sets in motion a pendulum that is swinging towards the other side of things, where people become too honest and steroids become way too normalized. A normalization that can often seem as glorification. Once you start opening up about a taboo subject, it kinda feels like a river dam that has slight cracks and then fully breaks. It goes very slow at first, but as soon as the cracks start to show, it will fully break. Steroid use was kind of similar in the sense that steroids were completely taboo at first, but as soon as people opened up about it, it set in motion that pendulum where people are now openly talking about it. People also didn't lower their expectations when they knew their favorite influencer was on steroids, they just started taking steroids as well. Because of those two things, the fitness industry is now in a phase where steroids are the norm. Knowing all of this, it doesn't really surprise me to see this 16-year-old taking high doses of drugs, viewing this normalization of their use. It's an unfortunate reality that we have come to this point, but to give some hope, I believe this trend will reverse in a positive way, where people will bring back some of the taboo around them and stop glorifying them. Now, is it better to be quiet or open about it is a difficult question, but I think it's necessary since I believe people will never be able to find a middle ground. In the end, my advice, if you consider taking PEDs, would be to wait as long as possible, but ideally never take them at all and not get influenced by sarm goblins online, as you will likely regret it later in life. So, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something.